Souvent encore, les enfants sont séparés dès l'école selon la religion de leurs parents. Dans une certaine mesure, c'est le cas au Royaume-Uni, dont l'une des 4 nations, et sans doute la plus importante, l'Angleterre, possède une église d'État, l'Église d'Angleterre qui organise un culte de religion anglicane, et dont le gouverneur suprême n'est autre que la reine d'Angleterre. En Angleterre et au Pays de Galles, la nation britannique la plus étroitement liée à l'Angleterre sur le plan politique et juridique, la prière quotidienne dans les écoles est obligatoire selon la loi. L'Écosse et l'Irlande du Nord ne sont d'ailleurs pas en reste sur ce point. Mon invité pour cet épisode est Alastair Lichten. Il est spécialiste des questions d'éducation pour la National Secular Society, une association laïque britannique. To this day, children are often segregated in schools, according to the religion of their parents. To some extent, this is the case in the United Kingdom, one of whose 4 constituting nations, arguably the core British nation, England, has an established church, the Church of England, whose supreme governor is none other than the Queen herself. In England and in Wales, the closest British nation to England politically and judicially, daily prayer is mandatory in schools by law. Scotland and Northern Ireland have similar laws. My guest for this episode is Alastair Lichten. Alastair is the specialist in education matters for the National Secular Society. So hi everyone, I'm thrilled to be here with Alastair Lichten. Alastair, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
You are the Education Campaigns Officer for the National Secular Society in the United Kingdom, if I'm correct.
Yes, I'm the Education and Schools Officer for the National Secular Society.
Okay.
The National Secular Society is the UK's oldest secularist. Actually, no, that's incorrect. It's the oldest national secular organisation. It's the only national organisation working exclusively on working for a secular society, secular state, secular society. As Education and Schools Officer, I work across the whole breadth of our campaign, breadth of our education campaigns. Education is probably our largest single area. It is certainly the area of public life where a lack of secularism most intrudes on the rights of ordinary British citizens. I guess our interest in the education system comes about because it is really a unique area of public life. Within British society, religious privilege and religious discrimination has really diminished across all sorts of fronts over the last century. We still have an established church, but that established church has, and that is still privileged in areas of public life, has retreated from public life, from a sort of day-to-day intrusion onto citizens' lives. And education is kind of unique in that we have, legalized state-backed discrimination. We have a heavy involvement of religious organizations, not just in delivering public services, but in making big decisions about how education is delivered, the form and the content of it. As a secularist organisation, we don't believe there should be any, or at least there should be as little as possible entwining of religion and state. And when we look out at our education system across all the nations of the UK today, we're clearly a long way from that.
So you are leading the No More Faith Schools campaign, which is aimed at ending, among others, segregation of school children on the basis of the parents' religion.
Yes, I mean, we have within the, and I should maybe just explain a little bit about the term faith schools, for those who may not be entirely familiar. A faith school is not a legal designation as such. A faith school is a description, and what the vast majority of people understand by a faith school is a state-funded school in which a religious organisation, which has a formal religious designation or ethos, in which a religious organisation plays some role in the governance and the running of the school. We have in the UK and within England alone a very wide variety of different types of faith school. You have some which are where religious organization has a very very strong amount of control in the running of the school, that's able to set its own confessional religious education curriculum, that's able to practice
Mm-hmm.
religious discrimination in admissions, that might potentially be able to select all of its teaching staff based on religion. And then you have a variety of different other types of schools where the religious influence might be a bit less. We have many religious schools that don't practice any direct religious discrimination in terms of admissions, but equally many that do. So there is that great variety of faith schools, and there are some that are more or less problematic. So when you begin to talk to people in this area and you start looking at some of the problems with faith schools, perhaps for many people, the religious discrimination in admissions is the most visible and for many the most concerning aspect. And you can begin to deal with some of those problems. You can reduce the harm of faith schools. You can try and restrict their ability to discriminate in admissions or in teacher hiring. You can try and restrict their ability to promote a confessional religious curriculum. But ultimately, reducing the harm isn't enough, because as long as you have the principle of the state funding religious based schools, you're gonna keep coming back to these problems. The No More Faith Schools campaign, when we set that up, we launched that. That was sort of just to stake out to say, actually, there's a principle that it's not just about dealing with all these individual problems and harm. There is a principled position here
Mm-hmm.
that state-funded education shouldn't be organised around religious identity.
Okay. I wanted to ask you because there is an official state religion in England, which is, of course, the Church of England. I wanted to ask you if there are actually any secular schools in England at all.
There are no. That's a difficult question to answer. Our issue is not just with faith schools. It's our issue is with the whole range of inappropriate religious, privileged religious input into our education system. So looking just at England, we have one category of schools which are called community schools, and without getting into real technical details of schools and academies and things, these community schools or community academies are generally seen
Mm-hmm.
as the secular option. So they're not formally designated as a faith school, and they can't practice discrimination in admissions. They can't practice discrimination in hiring. They have no formal, well, theoretically, they have no formal religious role in the governance of these schools. So they're generally speaking secular. However, even within those schools, we have a law in this country which mandates that every school should have a
Mm-hmm.
daily act of predominantly Christian worship. Um, Many of the community schools do just ignore that legal requirement, and or they might, conduct something which they kind of call collective worship, but really it's just an ethical assembly
Okay.
addressing contemporary moral issues. But a significant amount of our casework does come from people in community schools. As long as you have a law which mandates worship, you're going to have head teachers that take advantage of that law if they want to push worship. Our religious education curriculum is decided at local level by uh, these groups called SACREs, which feature religious representatives and varies widely. There's not anywhere in the system a guarantee for a secular education. If you
Mm-hmm.
if you go to a faith school, you by and large, people, you by and large know what that means. You know kind of what you're getting. It may not be something you actually want, and the vast majority of people, just pick their local school. But there are there's things in place to guarantee that a faith school is very faithy. There's not enough in place to guarantee that a community school is going to be a secular school.
Okay. Maybe we can focus briefly on the daily mandatory worship, because that's really a striking feature of the British education system. Yeah.
Yep. It's its roots are in the 19 many things in Britain. To understand why they are the way they are and the way they work, which doesn't make sense at first glance. You kind of need to look into the history, and our education system that's particularly true for. In a lot of the current settlement between sort of church and state within education dates back to 1944 Education Act. Prior to that, the Church of England had had a long involvement in running schools. It had provided schools for the community, and this was at a time when the nation was predominantly Christian, and this was sort of seen as more of a community service than necessarily a religious mission. By the time it came around to 1944, the state was entering into the education system in a much bigger way because various changes in society. And the agreement they had with the church at that point was to bring the church schools into the state system, and the church would sort of give up some of its absolute control over church schools, but in return would have influence in the running of the education system. And as part of that settlement, it was included into the law which affected all schools, the requirement for an act of predominantly Christian collective worship, a daily act in England and Wales. And in Scotland, they have a sort of analogous requirement. Fast forward to 2018, and we're approaching the 75th anniversary. It's almost 3/4 of a century since this requirement was brought into law, and you have a situation where it's no longer really tenable for that to be enforced in schools. So a large number of non-faith schools do just simply ignore this requirement. But as long as that requirement is there, if you've got a head teacher who wants there to be collective worship, they can put that in place. As long as that requirement's there, you're going to have organizations promoting themselves to schools saying, look, we can do this worship for you, we can provide that.
Okay. And concretely, who will be doing the leading of the actual acts of worship?
In non-faith schools, no teacher can be compelled to lead collective worship. So in non-faith schools where they are actually actively doing the worship, it will typically be maybe a head teacher or a senior teacher, someone who's quite enthusiastic and kind of it's the person who wants it to happen who will be probably taking charge of leading it. Or it might be provided by an external group, visitors coming in from religious organizations, perhaps the local church. Very typical thing we hear. There's a new head teacher's come into a school. They've decided they want to follow this requirement, and suddenly the local vicar's in there 4 days a week.
I see. Okay, so it's also very varied depending on the specific cases.
Yeah.
Maybe we can go through 2 or 3 statements that I saw on the NSS website, because I thought they were quite eye-catching, and I hope maybe you can give the audience a bit more details about the background for these statements. For instance, it's written somewhere on the website that in some parts of the country, parents are left with little other option but to send their child to a school with a religious ethos.
Yeah, and this is a particular problem in rural communities. It's not an exclusively rural thing. You can have particular areas of the country where school provision is low. The exact extent of this problem is very hard to identify. The Department for Education, which manages education in England, don't have a good estimate of it. The the suggestion put forward by people making a sort of a choice argument for faith schools sort of imagines that schools are like, products in a supermarket, and parents go into the supermarket and stroll along the aisles and look and pick up different products and compare them and pick the one that they like. And if they're religious parents, they might pick a faith school. But that's really not how picking a school works. I mean, for the vast majority of people, they look around and go, which is my local school? Which is my most convenient school? And that's the one I want to go for. Very few, the research does indicate that very few people pick schools based on them transmitting religious faith.
Hmm.
And if your local school is a faith school, uh, maybe you might go to your second local school, or maybe you might need to look for your third local school. But that's just not an option that's available for many parents. And you sort of imagine, what the educational setup is in many parts of England. If you're a small village and you've got one village school, and that school is a faith school, and in majority cases that would be a Church of England faith school. That's a real problem for you if you want there to be if you want to have a choice of a secular school. There, in the past, these Church of England schools, they're a majority of a type which is called voluntary controlled. And again, without going into history, the details, those sort of were seen as sort of those more light touch schools. They were they were faith schools, but a bit less faithy than others. But as the Church of England has really shifted its focus to be much more evangelical, to put much more pressure on, what it sees as its schools to promote their religious ethos, it is increasingly difficult for parents to find, a school that's, if their local school is a faith school, it's very difficult for them to in any way escape that religious ethos. You also have the problem in some parts of the country where you have faith schools being undersubscribed, and therefore people being sent to faith schools because that's the only option. I think the figure to mind straight away, but we did some freedom of information requests, and I think it was last year, and it was about 18,000. Uh, I'm just trying to get it, find the figure quickly. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so in September 2017, so that was the last school admissions period. There were 18,000 families who didn't have selective faith school as their first choice, whose children ended up in a faith school in England. Now,
Hmm.
we don't obviously that within that headline figure there'd be maybe some who didn't really mind. There be, but equally there'd be many people who do select a faith school as their first choice because it's their local school, not because they actually want a faith school. Um, there is just a narrative of choice created around the defense of faith schools. They're presented as, oh, people choose this, and that just really does ignore how parents, how people operate in the real world when they're just looking for a good local school for their children.
Hmm. If I were to play devil's advocate here, I would ask, because if it's 18,000 families in England, if I make a very rough estimate, I would guess it's around one family in 1,000 or something like this. Someone might say it's not very much, and maybe it's not such a big problem.
I think that represented 14% of admissions in September. That was
Oh,
14. I
okay.
think that was in 14% of admissions in
Oh.
September 2017. But that doesn't capture the full thing. But again, there will be within that 18,000 people, there will be people who don't really mind a faith school, but equally there'll be many people who have no choice but to pick a faith school. I don't really see what realistic choice a family has if the local school, and maybe there's only one school in their village, or maybe there's only one school that has places, or maybe there's only one school that doesn't require them taking a half hour diversion in the morning. It doesn't, and the research does just consistently shows people want good local schools. There is sort of again a narrative also created that faith schools are somehow necessarily better than non-faith schools, and some of the research around that is quite complicated, and that's kind of often used to conflate people wanting local faith schools as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I realize now that I actually sort of misunderstood the figure, because what I said would be true if,
Oh yeah, that was
what I've said would be true if the 18,000 number referred to, all the children of Britain, but what you are talking about is new entries in a given year, so it's quite different.
And there's also just a fundamental thing. If you are a family of faith, you have a choice of all the community schools plus faith schools.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're a non-faith family, you have the choice of, in many cases, just the choice of the community schools. So your choice is restricted, and there is also the being sent to a faith school does impinge on your religious freedom and your ability to raise your children in accordance with your own beliefs, in the way that being sent to a community school, a secular and religiously neutral school, doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have another follow-up question actually before we move on to the next statement that caught my eye on the website. You mentioned that the Church of England has become a bit more offensive. Well, how to say, a bit more aggressive or evangelizing. So this is something I hadn't heard about. Maybe you can, give some more information on this point.
Well, the Church of England does have a long, as they like to say, they do have a long history of involvement in education in this country. And
Mm-hmm.
if you think about the context in which that happened in a context in which the vast majority of people in the country were Christian. The Anglican Christianity was sort of seen as the default. And the Church of England didn't see the need to proselytize and promote itself in the same way. It kind of didn't feel the need to use its schools to promote its version of Christianity, because it just sort of felt confident that that was the default. The in a way, religious education used to be seen, as religious instruction. It was seen as a way of promoting the national religion and the nationally accepted view on religion. Things have begun to change, and I think the turning point may well have been there was a report the Church of England produced called the Church School of the Future, and this basically said, look, why are we tearing our shirts in anguish about how few people are in the pews on a Sunday? There's a million school children in our churches every day. So a million school children in our schools every day. That if the local vicar is upset that his church is empty, so they use this, I think, the phrase, to have his camp bed in the school. The many church schools, which sort of just used to be seen as more like community schools, these voluntary controlled ones, the Church of England gained the power to appoint the head teacher on religious grounds. There used to be 1/5 of teachers could be reserved, and then it became much more explicit that 1/5 of teachers who could be appointed on religious grounds or subject to religious tests could include the head teacher. The church has taken through academization a much more direct role in the governance of more schools. many non-faith schools are now find themselves in academy trusts. These are uh, governance structures for schools which are essentially state funded but are not under the control of local authorities. And many non-faith schools are in these trusts which have governors appointed by the Church of England. The Church of England inspect all C of E faith schools to ensure they are promoting a more rigorous religious ethos. The idea of sort of just promote holding sort of generic what they would call Christian values. They're much more focused now on framing shared value, sort of shared values such as kindness and respect as uniquely Christian.
Mm-hmm. Yes, some people will say that a religious framework is actually necessary to teach children, how to say, basic values, such as the one you mentioned. It's a common argument, I guess.
Yeah, but I mean, some people say a lot of things. Some people say the world's some people say the world's flat. Many people have a religious framework, and they raise their children in accordance with their religious framework. And that sort of education that is done within the family and within the faith community
Mm-hmm.
is something which should be respected and protected and left alone by the state. The type of education which is done by schools, which are something that we as a society fund together, that should not be based around religion. It should not. We shouldn't, and we do a real disservice to children when we're trying to teach them about shared values by saying that these values they're not shared. They are Christian or they're Muslim or they're Hindu or they're Jewish values. They are values which obviously many Christians, Muslims, Jews, non-religious people, Scientologists, whatever, share. Um, that's I think part of the perhaps more insidious aspect of faith schools, because often people say, "Oh, what's wrong with they're teaching they're teaching these great values," and it's like, well, non-religious schools teach those values as well, but they don't teach that they are exclusively or inherently or derived from a specific religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think what you're mentioning is sort of resonant with what I'm going to ask you next. Um, so it's also something I saw on your website, and here I will quote at some length. It's a pretty long sentence. So it says that the government's own data shows that faith schools are directly responsible for creating a ghettoized education system, where Britain's Jewish, Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim schools are monocultural zones that do nothing to foster, greater social cohesion.
Give you a bit of background. That it's almost 2 years ago now. We have a relatively new type of school in England called academies. These they're sort of a model I think they have in many other countries. In America, they might be called charter schools. There's a couple of European countries also called them academies, and they're basically um, centrally state-funded schools, but where the governance and the arrangement is done by an independent organization, a trust, which has a lot more leeway. Because one of the things they introduced in these schools was a requirement that that only half of the places could be only half the places could be filled using faith-based selection criteria. So 50% of the places be reserved for the people for students from that faith background, and then the remaining 50% need to be open to pupils from any faith background or none. This was known as the 50% cap, and the government originally proposed and even included it in their election manifesto belatedly to scrap this 50% cap in order predominantly to allow Catholic and Jewish academies to open because the Catholic Education Service and some Jewish groups have been reluctant to open schools where they couldn't practice 100% religious discrimination and religious selection in admissions. These plans were eventually abandoned because the government just acknowledged that this was not consistent with their proposed integration strategy. As part of that, the data came out on minority faith schools, including Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu schools, which were 90% plus pupils from one particular ethnic background, 90% plus pupils of the faith. These schools were not in any way appealing to families that didn't share that were from a different religious backgrounds, and the effect that has on the sort of the school ecosystem is when you create concentrations of one group in specific schools, it creates pressure on those families to send their children to that school, and it also takes those children out of the main school ecosystem. So the massive increase in the number of students from Jewish backgrounds who are going to Jewish faith schools is meaning there's less and less people from Jewish backgrounds in the mainstream school system. So once you start separating people, you create difference where there doesn't need to be. You deprive children of the ability to grow up with people from many different backgrounds to interact with them. You deprive the parents the opportunity to meet other parents of different religious backgrounds at the school gates.
Hmm.
Uh, these these schools were expected to promote integration, but if you looked at what they were asked to do to promote integration, it was in a very they were just asked basically to say that they think integration is a good idea. That meant it was almost sort of a farcical situation when these schools were in order to be funded by the state would say, oh no, definitely our school will be will attract people from all sorts of different religious backgrounds. And then if you looked at the facts, they just didn't.
Okay. So sometimes we hear horror stories, so to say, of children forced to sometimes exclusively study scripture for years in Orthodox Jewish schools. This can happen.
Our work, although our focus is on the state education system, our work
Hmm.
does encompass independent schools as well.
Yes.
Obviously, I think you have to recognise that independent faith schools are a different thing, and their right to exist is different to the sort of privilege of the state funding with the schools. The examples that I think you're talking about there, I will almost certainly those more extreme examples will be in independent schools, those places where there's very narrow or non-existent secular curriculum and a extreme focus on on rote learning of religion or just promoting of religious beliefs. Uh, we are
Hmm.
seeing, thankfully, that the state is increasingly looking at independent schools and thinking that just because children are at an independent school doesn't mean that they have it means that the state doesn't run the school. It means the state doesn't control the school, but it doesn't mean that the children attend them just don't have any rights. Young people have a right to an education, and they had the right for that to be safeguarded, and that means they have the right to learn something more than just the contents of a holy book.
Hmm. What is actually the status of these independent schools?
So all independent schools in England must be registered in order to operate a school. We do have a burgeoning unregistered and therefore illegal faith school sector. They're
Hmm.
required to follow the independent school standards. The National Secular Society has been involved in consultations over developing these and advocating for them to be uh, more rigorously applied and more consistently applied. Independent schools can, for they're given as many people understand, they are given a lot of leeway. They develop their own curriculum. They develop their own policies. They operate in their own ways, but there are some very basic um, standards, the independent school standards that they are expected to follow. They need to be inspected by a recognised inspectorate, so either a small number of independent inspectorates which are allowed, or Ofsted who inspect them. And since Ofsted have been inspecting more independent faith schools and holding them to the same standards as other independent schools, we've seen a real spike in the failures of independent faith schools. It's getting to a point where like every month we're identifying these schools that have a particularly narrow curriculum, and excessive and the secular curriculum being narrowed extremely in order to make way for specifically religious learning.
Uh-huh. Are these schools running entirely on private funds?
Yes, many will be registered charities as well. So they will receive tax breaks for that. But independent schools are independently funded.
Okay. And focusing specifically on the ones that have been shown or say strongly suspected of having very deficient curricula. In terms of numbers, what does this represent? Do you have some idea?
Take a look at some of the now the increase. It should be said that the increase in independent faith schools failing inspections could level off in future. It could be a result of a history of the sort of expectation of, oh, they're doing that, but it's a religious school, so that's okay. Almost half of independent faith schools are failing, which means they're rated as inadequate or requires improvement.
Wow. Okay.
This is according to a raft of inspections which took place in which were the results which were announced in November 2017. But in the monthly reports from Ofsted of the inspections of independent schools, that would be, that's pretty consistent.
Okay.
So 30 and that 49% of independent faith schools that are failing include 33% of Christian schools, 53% of Jewish schools, and 58% of Muslim schools, compared to 25% of non-faith independent schools.
And what's the proportion of British pupils who attend these independent schools?
It's difficult to tell. There will probably be a figure. I'm afraid I don't have a specific one at the moment. It's difficult to tell because of the lack of clarity around home education. Often people are sort of thought to be being home educated, but it's not clear exactly if they are in home education, if they're in the registered independent school sector. And we do have a burgeoning unregistered independent school sector.
Okay. I think I've reached the end of my questions, but probably I have failed to ask you something important. Maybe I don't know if you want to add something.
No, it was good chatting with you.
Okay. Well then, thank you very much, Alastair, for your time and your answers.
No problem.
Yeah, we will be following the further developments on this front with interest.
Yeah, and everyone can find out more at secularism.org.uk/education.
Yes, great. Sorry for forgetting to
no problem.
Ask you to plug this in, but yes, great initiative. Thanks again.
Cheers.
All the best in your efforts.
Thanks so much. It was good chatting with you. Maybe come back again sometime.
Sure. Let's keep in touch.